Many people getting into typology would experience initially thinking that they are one type, only to realize they've been wrong. Sometimes comically wrong. Some people might go through many different types before landing on the one that describes them best. I'm going to talk about the most common mistypes for each type. You'll notice a lot of recurring patterns throughout, the most obvious being the introvert-extrovert divide. Also, the way in which you mistype yourself will depend on your level of understanding about the types. Beginners, for example, will make more simple errors, such as believing the first result they get on the online tests. But more knowledgeable people will suffer from the more you know, the less you understand issue. I'm going to say the actual type that a person is, then talk about the other ones they might inaccurately think they are. ESTPs. ENTP. This is a very common mistype. Many ENTPs out there are actually ESTPs. There are loads of similarities between these two types. They have TI and FE in the same place, both have FI as a blind spot, and their overall energy style and vibe is really similar. One of the biggest factors I've noticed is that ESTPs can keep up with the ENTPs in conversation and match them. This is where SE and TI can look like NE and TI. Both types are getting different things from the conversation or interaction, but on the surface, it will look the same. An easy way to see the differences show up is to get these two types to work on something together, instead of just having a fun interaction. When they need to get something done, the tangible versus ideational divide will be much more stark. ENTPs will feel satisfied after generating lots of options, whereas ESTPs will get frustrated with the lack of action. ISTPs. ESTPs aren't always highly socially extroverted, so they might perceive themselves to be social introverts, and that might even be true, and therefore will think that ISTP must be a better fit. Despite the similarities, they are very different types though. ENFJ. This is a less common one, but definitely possible. ENFJs deeply value SE as a function and use it a lot. It's a source of release and relief for them, so they indulge in it a lot. So when they're in indulgent SE mode, they will definitely come across like ESTPs. They'll also have the same interpersonal charm and forcefulness that ESTPs possess. ENTJ. This is a mistype that people will make when first getting into typology. Both types are extroverts, logical, pragmatic, and big personalities. They are similar superficially, but they are very different types. ISTPs. INTP. Because of the biases of the online tests, lots of people get INTP as a result. I'm not really sure why this is the case, but it does seem to be a thing. So there are probably many people out there who resonate with lots of the description of the INTP type, but then don't relate to the lack of SE. They'll be more proactive, reactive, and action-oriented, as opposed to the more self-contained and passive nature INTPs often have. Those people are likely to be ISTPs. One thing that is important to remember about ISTPs is the influence and prominence of their third slot NI. They are a very intuitive type, despite having their SE higher than their NI. INFJ. If you have a well-developed and mature ISTP who has integrated their FE and realizes the importance of it, they're going to look like an INFJ in many ways. One thing I've encountered, and made the mistake of doing, is typing female ISTPs as INFJs at first. Since there are greater societal consequences and stigmas for women being disagreeable, that might take the edge off it, but who knows. ISFP. This is less common, but FI and TI can seem similar at times. These two types can fall into the same category of being lone wolf type figures, very independent, and with their own opinions, which they'll happily express in a blunt way. They also share their middle two functions. Also, when ISTPs, or TI, get described as being logical, pretty much everyone will relate to that, because everyone has to use logic to survive. So that description can be confusing. It's not a hugely common mistype, but it's possible. INFJ. ENFJ. Since INFJs come across very social and are people-focused by nature, they can look like extroverts, and therefore can mistype as ENFJs. The best way to test this is to see how a person acts when they have a choice about how much social interaction and the types of social interaction they can have. If an INFJ is in a situation at home, in school, or at work, where they essentially have to channel that social side of themselves, then they will be able to do it, quite consistently. In fact, INFJs might not realize how introverted they can be until they have the option to have as much alone time as they desire. INFP. This one is just because of the tests and using the letter understanding of the types. I do see these types as extremely different. However, to be fair, they are both introverts, intuitive types, feeling types, and types who struggle with TE and SE in certain ways. In that sense, there is a lot of overlap, so it is a forgivable mistype, especially when people are first learning about the types. INTJ. Believe it or not, I think that some INTJs are actually INFJs. Because NI is seen as such a mysterious function, I think that some people figure out that they're NI DOMs and then just stick with the first of these two types that they get as a test result. INFJs, with their third slot TI, are very much thinking types, just like INTJs, with their third slot FI, are very much feeling types. So there are subtleties. If you're an INFJ who's more intellectual and academic, or an INTJ who's more relational and people-focused, it can be hard to tell which type fits best. ENFJs. INFJ. Although ENFJs are one of the most extroverted types, at certain points in their life, they may not be in contact with many people, or might not get along with the people surrounding them. Because of this, they might incorrectly type themselves as INFJs. So if you are still young, or aren't totally enthused by the people in your life, you might want to wait a bit before deciding which type you are. ENTJ. This one is more common than is often talked about, but more so with people who are just getting into typology. Both of these types are big, bold personalities, highly energetic, and full of charisma and charm. If you are an ENFJ who is prone to taking charge and leading in situations, you might superficially look like an ENTJ. ENFP. This is another one that comes from a more basic understanding of typology. If you see yourself as an extrovert, an intuitive, and a feeler, then it's an understandable confusion. ENFJs are also very good at both kinds of intuition, so they can look really similar to ENFPs in their more zany, creative, and playful moments. ENTPs. INTPs. ENTPs are quite ambiverted, typically. Often they will see themselves as introverts for this reason. Their dominant function of NE is outwardly focused. It's observing and perceiving the world, drinking in information from anywhere it can find it. Although it's absorbing a massive amount, lots of what's going on is still internal. Again, the differences between INTPs and ENTPs will reveal themselves more with age, when you can have more choice in the people you're interacting with, or whether you are often seeking out people at all. ENTPs don't necessarily like people more than INTPs, but they do need them to bounce off of, or as an audience. INTJ. This is a surprising one, but I have seen it a lot. It might come from the fact that they have the same kinds of functions in the same order: intuition, thinking, feeling, and sensing. That might cause some confusion or similarity. These types are the so-called shadow types of each other. I've heard people talking about being in their shadow during unhealthy moments of their life. I'm not sure what I think about that, but it is interesting. A character like Gregory House from House MD is an example of a character who kind of seems like both types. Both INTJs and ENTPs claim him as one of their own. ENFPs. The stereotype of ENTPs being emotionless really underserves the ENTPs who lean into their FE and value it a lot. These ENTPs are unifiers, deal makers, and peacemakers. They lean into their empathy and ability to read and connect with people. These kinds of ENTPs will definitely mistype as ENFPs often. INTP. INTJ. INTPs versus INTJs is one of those archetypical dilemmas that people face when first learning about personality types. Superficially, people see the P versus J letter distinction and assume that INTJs are just more organized than INTPs. Well, actually that's kind of true, but there is much more to it than that. These types, whilst having archetypically similar outlooks and struggles, use totally different types of thinking, intuitive, sensing, and feeling functions. I've actually done a video on this type comparison, so feel free to check that out for more info. INFJ. Okay, so this is one that I rarely hear people talking about, but I think it happens a surprising amount. It's a combination of them having a similar vibe, and also a certain overlap in terms of their functions. They are both intuitive types, who are good at both kinds of intuition. They are both TI users, and value that function. They either don't value, or rarely use TE. They either don't value or rarely use SE, and they're also both FE users. When you think of characters like Yoda or Dumbledore, especially Dumbledore in the later movies, you have this archetype of a sagely figure, someone who's wise, but also logical and sharp. They are usually quiet, introverted, and not boisterous or in your face. They have a kind of introspective power to them. I think both INTPs and INFJs fit this vibe very well. Intellectual, philosophical, great mentors and teachers in certain ways. The kind of people you would turn to for advice or insight. So, although rarely talked about, I think this is surprisingly common. INFP. TI and FI can come across as being quite similar. The distinction between principles and values can be quite vague at times. If you're an INTP who is more artistic in their creative interests, you might, based on these stereotypical descriptions, believe yourself to be an INFP. Similarly, if you've integrated your FE, either because you've seen the value of doing so, or perhaps because you were raised in an environment that rewarded doing so, being a cold, harsh, brutal and blunt thinking type robot might not be something that you resonate with. ISFJs. INTP. Lots of people who are typed as an INTP are in fact ISFJs, in my view. I see both types as being framework and system builders, in some sense. Someone typed as an INTP might think to themselves, I'm pretty sure I'm not organized enough to be an ISFJ. But ISFJs and INTPs organize themselves in very similar ways, through habit, routine, analyzing patterns of what works and what doesn't, and over time, crafting together these processes that help them run their lives. It's that combination of TI and SI, or SI and TI, that really bind these types together. They both care greatly about solidifying logic into something that makes sense and works, either for themselves or more generally. Mature and well-developed versions of these types will resemble each other a lot. INFJ. This mistype happens a lot, especially with online tests, which seem to have a huge intuitive bias. These types have their middle two functions in common. They are both IJ types, which gives them a similar mindset in certain ways. They are control-based types, as I like to say, and their demeanor of being calm and gentle and thoughtful is also very similar. In certain ways, the functions of NI and SI can look alike. They both want to organize, narrow down, and come to conclusions based on patterns they've observed. ISTJs. Both ISTJs and INTJs have FE as a blind spot function, but the edge is taken off it for ISTJs, in my view, because they're more grounded on planet Earth and, well, in touch with humanity. If you have an ISFJ who's cultivated the ability to be blunt, direct, and disagreeable when needed, they might come across more like an ISTJ. ESFJs. ENFJ. These two types approach life using the same lens. They are highly relational, people-focused, excellent interpersonally, and have a lot of their happiness in life wrapped up in their relationships. They share that primary FETI imbalance, and both have a high or valued intuitive function. ESFJs will tend to be more grounded and balanced in life in general. ENFJs are much more likely to burn themselves out, for example. Both types are high energy, but I think ESFJs are slightly more chilled out, and ENFJs slightly more intense. ENTP. This is a controversial one. There are self-proclaimed ENTPs out there, going about their ENTP-ness, so to speak, who are in fact ESFJs. These two types are way more similar than you'll often hear about. They have all the same functions in a different order. Again, it's that combination of their dominant and third slot functions, FE and NE, in either order, that make them noticeably similar at times. ESFJs deeply value their NE, and ENTPs deeply value their FE. They regularly use and enjoy those functions. So ESFJs will often resonate with being highly creative, with the desire to be innovative and seek out novelty, as ENTPs are so often described. ISFJ. I'll put this one here, but it's pretty rare in my view. ESFJs are such an extroverted type that it's unlikely they'll see themselves as introverts. But it is possible, and ISFJ would be the type that they think they were in that case. ENTJs. INTJ. As I often say, just because you have an extroverted function as your dominant one, it doesn't automatically mean that you're socially extroverted as well. ENTJs aren't a particularly extroverted type all the time. Some ENTJs are very big, boisterous, in your face, and ultra-charismatic, but others are more academic, intellectual, quiet, and just introspective and introverted in nature. These ENTJs will almost certainly see themselves as being INTJs instead. ESFP. I think this mistype is common in both directions. ENTJs can also be wild and chaotic too. Yes, they might still live in a goal-directed way, but they can also approach life in that same unbridled and intense way as ESFPs. ENTJs can be impulsive and emotional and passionate. I think that ENTJs can resemble ESFPs at 2 points in their life. Firstly, when they're younger, since it's easier to unleash SE in your younger years, then when they're more mature and have fully integrated their SE and their FI. ESTJs. I think that people distinguish between ENTJs and ESTJs by seeing which one has the massive ambitions that are probably unrealistic, the ENTJ, and which one is focused on the mundane and day-to-day stuff, the ESTJ. Obviously, this is wrong. It's less about what they focus on, and more so how they go about those things. This is probably not that common. Usually it is the other way around, where people think that they're ENTJs and are in fact ESTJs. But it does still happen. INTJs. ISFP. This is a mistype that works both ways, in my experience. If you have an INTJ who's well developed, then their FI and SE will be bigger parts of their life. Also, FI is a big part of an INTJ's life to begin with. Their values are fuel to them. I saw a video once about someone making the case that David Bowie, who's often typed as ISFP, is in fact an INTJ. I also think that he's an INTJ, incidentally. But the point is that there's overlap here. You can debate whether some people could be one of these types, and in many cases, it's hard to choose. INFJ. I've described INFJs in the past as the thinking person's feelers. This is because their second slot FE is often used more as a tool to interact with people, and isn't implicitly valued in the same way as their dominant NI and third slot TI. INFJs, odd as it may seem, can even come across as detached and cold at times as well. I would even make the case, and have in the past, that the trajectory of getting to know each type is opposite. INTJs come across cold initially, but are much warmer as you get to know them. INFJs are much more socially smooth and charming even, but are far more logical and colder, so to speak, when you get to know them better. ENTJ. In theory, this one could be common, but I haven't seen it that much really. This would occur when you have an INTJ who is more outgoing, social, and aggressive in their approach to life. ISFPs. INTJ. ISFPs really value and make use of their NI, and can be every bit as ambitious and goal-driven as INTJs when that desire strikes them. So if you have an ISFP who is blazing down some path towards a goal, they'll see themselves as an introvert, NI user, creative, forceful, and driven, which matches up pretty well with the vibe of an INTJ. They have the same functions in a slightly different order, so it's easy for a person to find themselves in situations where they need to focus on functions in a different order, to prioritize them differently to usual, which therefore obscures their type. ISFPs are a deeply intuitive type, so INTJ is a natural mistype for them. INFP. Both these types can easily fall into the mold of being aesthetics lovers and connoisseurs, appreciators of art, beauty, creative people who want to find various vehicles for self-expression. Both types do like new experiences, but they'll go about acquiring those in very different ways. When you look at the online descriptions, and with the bias of the tests, you have loads of people typed as INFPs who are in fact ISFPs. ISTPs. This is less common, but I have encountered people who, initially, really seemed like ISTPs, but were in fact ISFPs. I think this is a vibe thing, and the eternal difficulties that come from equating TI with logic. If you see an ISFP making a point in an argument or debate, being logical, being concrete, being straightforward and linear in their thinking, they will look like ISTPs. ESFPs. ENTJs. Contrary to the stereotype of ESFPs always being chaotic, when they're in positions of leadership, they can strongly resemble ENTJs. Again, this comes down to development and maturity. An ESFP who makes use of their third slot TE a great deal is going to look and be ENTJ-like. They'll be organised, wanting to get things done, and dedicated to some long-term goal or ambition. ESTPs. Because SE-DOMs have such a distinctive energy to them, it's natural for people to confuse them. ESFPs can be blunt, disagreeable, overly direct, and aggressive, all things that are associated with the ESTP stereotype, and to be fair, the ESTP type in reality as well. Superficially, these two types can be hard to tell apart. In terms of vibe, ESTPs will tend to show their cold, detached, and pragmatic side much more, whereas ESFPs will show their passionate, fierce, and fiery side more. ISFPs. ESFPs can be quite introverted. Like a lot of extroverted types, they can satisfy their functions and desires without always needing to involve other people. If an ESFP, when younger, for example, isn't focused much on people, then there isn't much reason they'd see themselves as extroverts. They'd probably identify more with their FI, since SE is simply the way that they interface with and move through the world. It's something they might not even notice, which is often the case with our dominant functions. ENFPs. ENTPs. NE dominant types are so distinctive that a person trying to type themselves, at first, could see their own mindset reflected in either type. It's only when they dig deeper that they realize the big differences. ENTPs are far more detached than ENFPs. There is a peculiar neutrality to them. ENFPs, on the other hand, tend to have much stronger preferences and values that they're happy to stick with despite their explorative nature. INFPs. I think this is a really common one, since, as is often talked about in typology, ENFPs are usually ambiverts. ENFPs, in their more introverted moments, look like INFPs, basically. Over time, the way these types use their energy and the cycles they encounter will show the difference between them quite well. ENFPs take on too much, spread themselves too thin, and get overwhelmed. INFPs struggle more with inertia, not getting started, not getting things off the ground, and pulling the trigger in life. ESTJ. This is more common in the opposite direction, but if an ENFP happens to be well balanced with their functions, they might assume that they're an ESTJ because they're more organized, structured, and don't identify with being chaos monkeys. INFPs. ENFP. These two types are similar in many ways. Not every INFP is going to resonate with being super introverted. They might be outgoing, social, relational, and adventurous, and might therefore see themselves as extroverts. Also, it's common for a type's highest extroverted function to be the one that people see, so INFPs are projecting that NE outwards into the world, and might see it as their main function for that reason. ISFP. Not every INFP is going to resonate with being stuck in a fantasy world or being detached from reality. Some INFPs are very concrete in their approach to life and take action consistently. So an INFP might read the descriptions of themselves, being totally oblivious to their environment, and think, that can't possibly be me. INTP. Maybe a surprising one, but it definitely happens. INTPs are often described as creative, intelligent, artistic, and logical. An INFP is not going to think, oh, no, I'm not logical at all. Everyone uses logic. So if they haven't examined the differences between these two types, it's a natural mistake to make. Another factor is that INFPs, contrary to the stereotype, are not going to be overtly emotional often. In fact, they are more likely to process those things internally and privately. ISTJs. INTJ. I heard Michael Pierce once say that, although INTJs have the nickname of mastermind, the logical or logistical mastermind title could equally belong to ISTJs. ISTJs are also control-based types who are massive planners. Since they are so receptive to the ways in which things can go wrong, they put contingency plans in place. Because INTJ is such a common test result, there are a great deal of INTJs out there who are actually ISTJs. ISTP. Both types are introverts, sensing types, thinkers, and both struggle with NE in various ways. Superficially, they'll both be problem solvers who see and bluntly point out errors that other people are making in their thinking or actions. Both of these types are great critics and great doers in equal measure. Since ISTJs are a sensing dominant type, they might relate to the notion of having high SE. In a sense they do because they are good at both sensing functions. ESTJ. This is simply when an ISTJ doesn't relate to being extremely introverted. I think this can happen for a lot of them, since they're typically less detached and isolated than most introverts. ESTJs. ENTJ. I think these two types are very similar. Since ESTJs are naturally drawn towards solving problems by any means necessary, and they have NE as a prominent function, innovative, creative, and even risky solutions are always on the table for them. Yes, they will lean towards something already tested and proven at first, but if that's not available, it won't stop them being highly unorthodox if they need to be. ENTP. Both of these types have valued NE, SI in their stack, are extroverted types who are thinkers, who can do both kinds of thinking very well. Both types also have low or devalued FI. ESTJs can easily find themselves involved in many projects and interests in an NE-esque way, and channel that function in pretty much everything they do. ISTJ. I've described ESTJs as one of the most active types, if not the most active. However, I've personally seen ESTJs be capable of working on their projects and plans, etc., at home, on their own, without needing to seek out huge amounts of social interaction. During these phases of their lives, they might naturally see themselves as introverts. I have quite a few videos on the channel comparing types that people often confuse, so feel free to check those out, and while you're doing so, please subscribe to the channel as well. It makes a really big difference to well, my desire to see the number going up. And also lots of other good things.